Poor rancher married fat stranger for a cow. On wedding night, she locked the door. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. In a remote corner of the American West, where the rugged terrain stretches for miles and the days can be long and lonely, lived a rancher named Thomas. He was a man of modest means, living in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, with only his cattle to keep him company. Thomas had spent his life working the land, toiling in the sun and dust, and although he wasn't wealthy, he had enough to get by. He was a man of few words, quiet in nature, and content with his simple life. But his life was about to change in a way he never expected. One day, an opportunity came his way. A wealthy landowner from a neighboring town offered Thomas a deal that he couldn't resist. In exchange for a valuable cow, Thomas was to marry a woman he had never met. The proposition was strange, to say the least, but it promised to solve some of his financial struggles. At first, Thomas hesitated. He wasn't a man who took risks, especially when it came to matters of the heart. But with the promise of a better life and the security of owning a prized cow, he couldn't turn it down. So, he agreed to the deal, and preparations were made for the wedding. On the day of the ceremony, Thomas found himself standing in front of a small church in the middle of nowhere. The guests were few, and the atmosphere was tense. He had never met his bride, and the thought of marrying a complete stranger filled him with anxiety. But as the doors of the church opened, he was struck by what he saw. The woman standing at the altar was unlike anything he had imagined. She was large, much larger than any woman Thomas had ever encountered. Her face was kind, but there was a certain heaviness to her presence that made him uncomfortable. She wore a simple white dress, and although it didn't fit her well, she carried herself with an air of confidence. As they exchanged vows, Thomas couldn't help but feel conflicted. He had hoped for a beautiful, delicate bride, but instead, he was marrying a woman who didn't fit the traditional mold of beauty. Still, he promised to be a good husband, and the ceremony was completed. That night, after the wedding feast and the festivities had died down, Thomas and his new wife retired to their cabin. It was then that the first sign of trouble appeared. His new wife, who he had expected to be meek and obedient, locked the door behind them as soon as they entered. Thomas was taken aback. He had assumed that the night would be filled with the usual excitement and anticipation of a newlywed couple, but instead, his bride seemed distant, almost cold. He stood there for a moment, confused and unsure of what to do next. His new wife, however, remained silent. She sat down on the bed and motioned for him to join her, but it was clear that something was off. Thomas felt a pang of disappointment. He had hoped for warmth, for connection, but instead, he was faced with an unfamiliar barrier. What had he gotten himself into? As the evening grew darker, Thomas sat quietly on the edge of the bed, unsure of what to say or do. His new wife, Catherine, remained motionless across from him. The room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, casting shadows on the wooden walls of their small cabin. The weight of the silence between them was almost unbearable. He had expected their first night together to be filled with excitement, but instead, it was heavy with an awkwardness neither of them knew how to break. Thomas had hoped to get to know her better, to find some sort of connection in this strange new chapter of his life. But Catherine, his new bride, seemed distant, almost like she had already built an invisible wall between them. As the minutes ticked by, Thomas finally decided to speak. "Catherine, we've just started our journey together. I know this is all so sudden, but I want to try. I want to make this work." He watched as she slowly turned her head to face him. Her expression was unreadable. For a moment, he thought she might say something, but instead, she simply nodded. There was no warmth in the gesture, no hint of affection, only an acknowledgement. She slowly rose from the bed and walked towards the small window in their cabin. The night air was cool as it drifted in, and the sound of crickets chirping outside only deepened the silence inside. "I'm not here because I want to be," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas felt his heart drop. He had always known this marriage wasn't built on love, but hearing her say it aloud was a bitter pill to swallow. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. She turned to face him, her eyes distant and hard, as if she had already closed off any hope of a connection. "You were a business arrangement. A way out. I didn't choose this. I didn't want this life. But I have no choice. I'm here because my family owes a debt, and you're the payment." Thomas sat there, stunned. He had expected hardship. He had known this wasn't a love match. But hearing her say it so plainly shook him to his core. He had married her for a cow, but she had married him for survival. The weight of that realization hit him like a freight train. "I never wanted to be part of some deal. I never asked for this," she continued, her voice growing a little stronger. "But my family needed the cow, and you were the one willing to give it." Thomas didn't know what to say. He had promised himself he would make the best of it, but now it felt like he had walked straight into a trap with no way out. He couldn't help but wonder, if it had been someone else offering a cow, would he still have found himself here? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Catherine's voice again. "I'll do what I can to help you with the ranch. I won't make things harder for you, but don't expect me to be what you dreamed of." She turned away from him, and for the first time since their marriage, Thomas saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Regret? Pain? It was hard to say. She may have been doing this out of necessity, but there was something in her expression that suggested she wasn't entirely at peace with it either. He let out a sigh, not knowing whether to be angry, disappointed, or sympathetic. "I didn't dream of anything," he said softly. "I only thought of survival too. I guess we're both here for that." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, and for the first time since they had been married, Thomas felt the weight of their shared burden. Neither of them wanted this life, but here they were, tied together by circumstances beyond their control. As the night wore on, the reality of their situation settled in. Neither of them could escape their pasts or their obligations. They were two people bound by a contract neither had chosen, trying to make something of a marriage that was built on nothing more than necessity. What happened next was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the road ahead would not be easy. The days following their wedding passed in an uneasy silence. Thomas did his best to tend to the ranch, while Catherine, his new wife, kept to herself, her distant nature never once wavering. At first, Thomas was too focused on managing the cattle and repairing fences to really notice her. He had his own duties, his own worries. But over time, he began to observe little things. She never asked for anything, not even a warm meal or a conversation. She spent her days cleaning, organizing, and occasionally helping him with the farm work. But there was no real connection between them. It wasn't that she was unfriendly, she just seemed completely indifferent to him. Thomas tried not to let it bother him, but it weighed heavily on him at night, when the long hours of silence seemed to stretch on forever. Catherine's coldness was like an invisible wall between them. She might as well have been a stranger who had walked into his life and stayed for reasons beyond his understanding. But even in the silence, Thomas could see moments of vulnerability in her. In the mornings, when she thought he wasn't looking, he saw the way she would rub her eyes as if wiping away tears, or how her face would soften when she thought she was alone. He couldn't quite place it, but it seemed like there was more to her than just the woman who had reluctantly married him for a cow. One day, after a particularly grueling morning of fixing the fence that had been damaged in the storm, Thomas decided to confront her. He couldn't go on living in this strange, emotionless existence. As he entered the house, he saw Catherine sitting by the window, looking out over the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the land. For a moment, Thomas hesitated. It was as if the weight of the silence was too much to break, but he knew he had to try. "Catherine," he called gently. She didn't turn around at first. Her posture was stiff, but slowly, she stood and turned to face him. Her face was unreadable, and Thomas could sense the distance in her eyes. "What is it, Thomas?" she asked, her voice flat, almost like a reflex. He sighed, taking a step closer. "I can't keep living like this," he admitted, his voice thick with frustration. "I know we didn't get married for love, but that doesn't mean we can't try. We're two people stuck together in this house, and I don't want us to just exist. I want something more." Catherine looked at him for a long moment, her eyes unreadable. Thomas felt his heart race as he awaited her response. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "I never asked for this either," she said, the words almost lost in the silence. "I never wanted to be here, trapped in a marriage with someone I barely know. But I had no choice. Thomas felt a pang of sympathy, though he was still angry. I understand that, he said softly. But what do we do now? We can't just keep living like this. I want to try, Catherine. I want to make this work, even if it's hard. She stood there for a moment, contemplating his words. Then, slowly, she walked over to the fireplace, where a small fire was burning. She stared at the flames, as if they held some secret, and Thomas couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. I never wanted to be someone's burden, she said, her tone heavy with regret. I wanted more for myself. I wanted a life that was my own, not one built on someone else's charity. The honesty in her words caught Thomas off guard. It wasn't the response he had expected, but it was the truth. She wasn't just cold and distant because she wanted to be. She was struggling with her own shame and the weight of the decisions made for her. Thomas stepped closer, his heart softening. I'm not here to pity you, he said quietly. I'm here to make this work, not just for me, but for both of us. Catherine looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time since their wedding, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, hope. Maybe we can try, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we can find a way to make this work. But it won't be easy. Thomas nodded, feeling the tension in his chest loosen. It wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he felt like there was a chance for something more than just surviving. There was a chance for them to truly start building a life together, no matter how unlikely it seemed. As the night drew on and the fire crackled in the hearth, Thomas and Catherine sat together in silence, the weight of the past still heavy between them, but the first seeds of something new starting to grow. They didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, they had each other. As days passed, a subtle change began to occur between Thomas and Catherine. The awkward tension that had previously defined their relationship slowly started to dissipate. They began to talk more, share more, and in their small, quiet way, try to understand one another. Catherine, who had once been distant and cold, started to reveal more about herself, her past, and the reasons she had been so reluctant to open up. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the sprawling fields. It was a peaceful moment, one that Thomas had never imagined he'd share with her. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was companionable. You know, Catherine began, breaking the quiet. I never imagined life could be this simple. Thomas turned to look at her, surprised by her words. What do you mean? He asked. I mean, she continued, her gaze fixed on the horizon. When I was younger, I always thought life would be full of excitement, adventure. I dreamed of leaving home, traveling the world, making something of myself. But instead, I ended up here, married to a man I barely knew, working the land like everyone else in my family. I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to me. But now, I'm starting to think maybe it's not so bad. Thomas nodded, understanding more than she realized. He had once dreamed of greater things too, but life had a way of pulling people into its own rhythm, whether they were ready or not. I get that, he said softly. I had big dreams once too. But life has a way of pushing us in directions we didn't expect. Sometimes, you just have to make the best of what you have. Catherine smiled faintly, though there was sadness in her eyes. I never thought I'd end up here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm starting to think maybe I'm not as stuck as I thought I was. Thomas studied her for a moment. He could see the wheels turning in her mind, the beginnings of a change in her perspective. He wanted to say something encouraging, but he wasn't sure what to say. Instead, he simply offered a quiet smile. We're not stuck, he said, his voice steady. We're just figuring things out, together. The words seemed to resonate with Catherine. For the first time in a long while, she looked at him with something akin to hope. The weight of her past, the shame she had carried, began to lift, even if just a little. She wasn't alone anymore. They weren't just two strangers bound by a contract. They were starting to become partners in this life they had been thrust into. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Catherine didn't lock the door. She left it ajar, just a crack, as if allowing for the possibility of something more than just survival. Thomas didn't take advantage of the open door. He didn't need to. It was a small but significant gesture. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, there was room for more than just the cold distance between them. As the days turned into weeks, they continued to work together, side by side, learning to appreciate each other's company. They found a rhythm in their daily tasks, from tending to the cattle to fixing the fences and tending the small garden Catherine had started. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. One afternoon, as they were working on the garden, Catherine turned to him with a small smile. "I never thought I'd say this," she said, "but I think I'm starting to like it here." Thomas raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You mean it?" She nodded. "Yeah, I'm not saying it's all roses, but it's peaceful. I can get used to this." Thomas smiled back at her, feeling a warmth spread through him. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time since their wedding, he felt like there was hope for them. He didn't know what the future held, but at least now, they were facing it together. The next morning, as they worked together to repair a broken fence, they shared an easy laughter. It was a simple moment, but for Thomas, it was everything. He had always believed that true connections were built over time, through shared experiences and mutual respect. And now, he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, this strange marriage could turn into something more. He wasn't sure if love was in their future, but he was willing to find out. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the ranch, Thomas and Catherine stood side by side, looking out at the land they were learning to share. In that moment, they were no longer strangers. They were partners, building something together, even if they didn't know exactly what that something would be. Weeks passed, and the quiet bond between Thomas and Catherine grew stronger. They had become a team in every sense of the word. From tending to the animals to managing the ranch, their lives were intertwined in ways that seemed both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. Thomas noticed that Catherine was beginning to change. The coldness that had once defined her demeanor was now replaced with a quieter, more thoughtful presence. She was no longer the distant, reluctant wife he had married for a cow. Instead, she had become someone he could rely on, someone whose opinions he valued. One afternoon, while they were working together in the barn, Thomas noticed Catherine looking at the old wooden barn door with a thoughtful expression. "You know, this place has potential," she said, running her hand over the rough wood. "With a little work, we could turn this into something special." Thomas glanced at her, surprised by the enthusiasm in her voice. He had always viewed the barn as just another part of the ranch, something to keep in working order. But now, through Catherine's eyes, he saw the possibilities. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. Catherine smiled, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "Well, it's sturdy enough. We could fix the roof, patch up the walls, and maybe even add some storage space. I think it could be a good place for the livestock during the winter." Thomas nodded slowly. It made sense. The barn had always been a functional space, but with a little effort, it could be more. "Let's do it," he said, a sense of determination settling over him. They spent the next few weeks working on the barn, repairing the roof, strengthening the walls, and making the space more efficient. It was hard work, but it was satisfying, and for the first time, Thomas felt like they were building something together, something that was truly their own. One evening, after a long day of work, Catherine sat down beside Thomas on the porch, the sunset casting a warm glow over the land. They both sat in silence for a while, watching the colors change in the sky. "You've been quiet lately," Thomas said, turning to her. "Is everything okay?" Catherine hesitated for a moment, her fingers playing with the edge of her sleeve. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about how far we've come. When we first got married, I thought it was just going to be a way to survive, to get by. But now it feels like we've built something more. Something real." Thomas looked at her, surprised by her words. He had never thought about it that way, but now that she mentioned it, he realized that in the months since their marriage, they had built something strong. A partnership based on trust, respect, and shared purpose. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm starting to feel at home here," Catherine continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think I could ever feel like this again, after everything that happened, but I do. I feel like I've found a place where I belong." Her words touched something deep inside Thomas. He had always believed that home wasn't just a place. It was the people who made it special. And for the first time, he realized that Catherine wasn't just his wife. She had become a part of his life, someone he could count on, someone who had a place in his heart. "I'm glad," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm glad you feel that way." They sat there together, the cool evening air surrounding them, and for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt a sense of peace. They were no longer just two people stuck in a marriage of convenience. They were building a life together, one step at a time. That night, as they lay in bed, something shifted between them. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic moment, just a quiet understanding that had developed over time. Catherine reached for Thomas's hand, her touch warm against his skin. He squeezed it gently, a silent promise passing between them. They had come a long way from the awkwardness of their first days together. And although their journey was far from over, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that, together, they could face anything. And that, in itself, was enough. As the weeks turned into months, the seasons began to shift on the ranch. The warm summer days gave way to the cool, crisp air of fall. The ranch, once a symbol of loneliness and isolation, had become a place where Thomas and Catherine had found not only their rhythm, but a growing sense of unity. They had learned to live with each other's imperfections, and in doing so, they had built something solid, something real. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. One day, as Thomas worked on mending a fence along the far side of the ranch, he noticed Catherine standing by the barn, staring out at the fields. She was holding a small bundle of herbs, a slight frown on her face as she worked, almost lost in thought. Thomas took a break from his work and walked over to her. "Everything all right?" he asked, standing beside her. Catherine looked up at him, her expression softening. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, her voice more thoughtful than usual. "About how far we've come. I know I didn't expect much when I first came here, but this place, this life, it's starting to feel like home. More than I ever thought it would." Thomas smiled, his heart swelling at her words. "It's been a journey, hasn't it?" he replied, his voice warm with appreciation. Catherine nodded. "It has. And it's been harder than I expected, but also more rewarding." She paused, looking out across the fields again. "When I first got here, I thought I would always feel out of place. But now, I can't imagine leaving. Not now." Thomas stood there for a moment, absorbing the weight of her words. He had come to realize that their journey together wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building something that mattered. And in that, they had found something unexpected: peace. Catherine turned back to face him, her eyes meeting his. "I know it hasn't been easy," she said, her voice softer now. "But I'm starting to think maybe we were meant to find each other. Maybe we were meant to do this together." Thomas reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "Maybe we were," he said, his heart full. They stood there for a moment, the wind rustling the leaves around them. And for the first time, Thomas felt a deep sense of connection to the land, to Catherine, and to the life they were building. It was more than he had ever dreamed of. Later that evening, as the two of them worked together to prepare dinner, a feeling of contentment settled over them. The cabin, once small and cold, now felt warm and inviting, filled with the sounds of their shared laughter and the comfort of routine. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Thomas found himself looking at Catherine in a way he hadn't before. She was no longer the distant stranger he had married out of necessity. She was someone he cared about, someone who had become a part of his world. He wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing her as just his wife and had started seeing her as a partner in every sense of the word. He felt a shift inside himself, a deep, quiet understanding that their bond had grown beyond anything he had anticipated. Catherine, sensing the change in the air, turned to him and smiled. "You know," she said softly, "I never thought I'd say this, but I think we've built something here. Not just the barn or the fences, but something that matters." Thomas smiled back, his heart full. "We've built something worth fighting for," he said. As the fire crackled in the hearth, the two of them sat in comfortable silence, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt ready to embrace it, knowing he wasn't alone. Their journey had been difficult, but it had also been the start of something new, something neither of them had expected. And in that quiet moment, Thomas realized that sometimes the best things in life come not from the dreams we chase, but from the ones we least expect. The next day, as they worked together on the ranch, Catherine spoke up again. "I've been thinking about the future," she said, her voice steady. "About what we want to do with this place. It's not just a farm, it's our home. And I think we should build something bigger. Something that will last." Thomas looked at her, a a sense of excitement building in his chest. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. Catherine smiled. "Let's make it a place for others. Let's turn it into a ranch that can help people. We've got the space, the land, and the resources. I think we can do more with it." Together, Thomas felt a thrill of anticipation. It was an idea he had never considered, but now that she said it, it felt right. "Let's do it," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "Let's build something that matters." And with that, the next chapter of their journey began, one filled with promise, hope, and the certainty that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. As the months passed, Thomas and Catherine worked tirelessly on their dream. They had transformed the ranch from a simple piece of land into something more, something they could both be proud of. They began to expand the barn, adding extra stalls for livestock, and even started building a small guest house for travelers. The idea of turning the ranch into a place that could help others, just as Catherine had suggested, began to take shape. They had become more than just a couple bound by a marriage of necessity. They had become partners in every sense of the word. Their bond had deepened with every project they took on, every challenge they overcame together. Thomas had never imagined that his life would turn out like this. When he had first met Catherine, he saw her as nothing more than a way to secure the cow he had been promised. He never expected her to become such an integral part of his life. She was no longer the distant woman he had married for survival. She was someone he could rely on, someone he cared about deeply. It wasn't just the work they were doing that had changed things. It was the small moments, the quiet talks after dinner, the shared laughter as they repaired the fences, the way she would look at him with warmth in her eyes when they finished a long day of hard work. It was in those moments that he realized how much he had come to rely on her. Catherine, too, had changed. She had started to find a sense of purpose in the work they were doing. The life she had once thought of as a burden now felt like something she could embrace. The ranch had become her own, too. She was no longer just a wife to a rancher. She was an equal partner, someone who had a stake in their shared future. One evening, after a particularly long day of repairs, Thomas and Catherine sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the ranch. The sky was painted with vibrant colors, and for the first time in a while, they sat in comfortable silence, content with the progress they had made. "I've been thinking," Catherine said, breaking the silence. Thomas turned to her, his curiosity piqued. "About what?" She looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "About how far we've come. When we first got here, I thought I was just going through the motions, just doing what I had to do to survive. But now it feels different. It feels like we're building something. Together." Thomas smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He had never imagined this kind of partnership when he had first agreed to marry her. But now, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I feel the same way," he said softly. "I never thought this would be our life. But it's ours now, and I wouldn't want to do it with anyone else." Catherine smiled back, a warmth in her expression that Thomas hadn't seen before. It was as though a weight had been lifted from both of them. They were no longer just surviving. They were living. As they sat there, the last light of the day faded, leaving only the soft glow of the fire in the hearth behind them. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, one that felt like a turning point. They weren't just a rancher and his wife anymore. They were a team, working side by side to build a life they could both be proud of. The next day, as they continued their work on the ranch, Thomas noticed that there was a new sense of purpose in Catherine's step. She was more confident, more engaged in the work they were doing. It was clear to him that she had found a place for herself here, not just as his wife, but as an equal partner in their shared dream. That afternoon, after finishing a particularly difficult task, Catherine turned to him with a smile. "I was thinking," she began. "We've done a lot of work here, but there's still more to do. I want to make this ranch not just a place to live, but a place where others can find refuge, too. We could take in travelers, teach them how to live off the land, help them build their own futures." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. The idea was bold, but it was also exactly what he had been hoping for. It was more than just surviving. It was about giving back, sharing what they had learned with others. "I love the idea," he said, his voice full of excitement. "Let's do it. Let's make this place a sanctuary for people who need it." Catherine's face lit up with a smile, and for the first time, Thomas saw the woman he had married, not as a reluctant bride, but as someone who was beginning to find her own place in the world. They were building something bigger than just a ranch. They were building a legacy, something that could help others and make a real difference in the world. As the sun set on another day of hard work, Thomas and Catherine stood together, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. They had come a long way from the awkward strangers they had been on their wedding day. And now, as they looked out at the land they had transformed together, they knew that their journey was just beginning. As the months went by, Thomas and Catherine's vision for the ranch began to take shape. They had started taking in travelers, just as they had planned. Word spread quickly, and soon, people from all over the region were arriving at the ranch, seeking shelter, food, and guidance. Some were farmers looking for a fresh start, others were families displaced by harsh conditions or drought. It wasn't long before the ranch became a beacon of hope for those in need. Catherine took the lead in organizing the space, helping the newcomers learn the ways of the land. She taught them how to tend crops, raise livestock, and live sustainably. She had found a deep sense of purpose in this work, and it showed in the way she interacted with the people who came to them. Thomas, on the other hand, focused on the more practical aspects of the ranch. He continued to work on repairs and upgrades, ensuring that the land was fertile and that everything was running smoothly. Together, they had transformed the place into a thriving hub of activity. It wasn't just a ranch anymore, it was a community. As they worked side by side, Thomas began to realize just how much he had changed. The quiet, solitary man who had once been content to live alone had found his place in a bustling, growing family. And it wasn't just the people who had come to stay at the ranch, it was Catherine, too. She had become more than just his wife. She was his partner in every sense of the word. Their bond had deepened in ways that were hard to describe. They didn't just work together, they shared dreams, hopes, and plans for the future. They had become a team, and their success was a testament to their combined effort. One evening, after another long day of work, they sat together by the fire, watching the flames flicker in the hearth. The night air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt like the calm after a storm. "You know," Catherine said, breaking the quiet, "I never imagined it would be like this. I never thought I would find my place here, with you, on this ranch." Thomas looked at her, a warm smile tugging at his lips. "I don't think either of us thought it would be like this," he said, his voice soft. "But we made it work." Catherine nodded, her eyes distant as she gazed into the fire. "I've realized something," she said slowly. "Something I never thought I'd feel. I'm not just living here anymore. I'm part of something bigger. We're building something that's going to last." Thomas's heart swelled with pride. He had always believed that the work they were doing mattered, but hearing Catherine say it made it real. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were creating a legacy, one that would carry on long after they were gone. "We're not just building a ranch," Thomas said, his voice filled with conviction. "We're building a future for the people we help and for ourselves." Catherine turned to him, her eyes soft. "I never thought I'd find a place where I belonged," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now, I feel like I've found it. With you. With all of this." Thomas reached for her hand, his fingers gently brushing against hers. He squeezed it softly, as if to reassure her. "We've both found our place," he said quietly. Together, they sat in silence for a while longer, the warmth of the fire surrounding them. It was hard to believe how far they had come, from a marriage of necessity to a life built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. The ranch was more than just a piece of land now. It was a symbol of everything they had achieved together. But as they sat there, watching the flames dance, Thomas couldn't help but wonder what the future held. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but one thing was certain. He wasn't facing them alone. And that was more than enough. The next day, as they continued their work with the new arrivals, Thomas and Catherine received unexpected news. A neighboring ranch had fallen into hard times, and its owner was seeking help. The ranch had once been thriving, but now it was struggling to survive. The owner, a man named Henry, had heard of Thomas and Catherine's success and was hoping they could help him turn his ranch around. At first, Thomas hesitated. He didn't want to stretch themselves too thin. The ranch was already a lot of work, and they had just begun to settle into their new role. But Catherine saw the potential. "This could be an opportunity," she said, her eyes bright with possibility. "We've learned so much, and we could help someone else. This could be a chance to make an even bigger impact." Thomas thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "You're right," he said. If we can help, we should. And so, they set off to visit Henry's ranch. It was a long journey, but they were determined to help. They didn't know what challenges awaited them, but they knew that together, they could face anything. The ranch had become more than just their livelihood. It had become their calling. And with every challenge they faced, they grew stronger, more confident in their ability to make a difference. As they rode out towards Henry's ranch, Thomas and Catherine realized that their journey was far from over. They had built a life here, but now it was time to extend their reach. They were no longer just two people trying to survive. They were leaders, building a future not just for themselves, but for everyone they could help along the way. As Thomas and Catherine arrived at Henry's ranch, they were greeted by the sight of a property that had once been full of life, but was now in disrepair. The fences were broken, the fields overgrown, and the barn seemed to sag under the weight of neglect. It was clear that the ranch had once been a prosperous place, but it had fallen on hard times. Henry, the owner, was an older man with a weathered face and a tired smile. He welcomed them warmly, his gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you for coming," he said, shaking Thomas's hand. "I didn't know where else to turn. I've tried everything to get this place back on its feet, but I just can't do it alone anymore." Thomas looked around at the land, feeling the weight of Henry's words. The challenges here were evident, but they were not insurmountable. "We'll help however we can," Thomas said firmly, his voice steady. Catherine, who had been quietly observing the scene, stepped forward. "We've been where you are," she said, her voice warm but determined. "It's not easy, but if we work together, we can bring this place back. It's about more than just fixing buildings. It's about building a future." Henry's eyes softened, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "I'm not asking for a miracle," he said. "Just a chance. A chance to keep this place alive for my family. I can't let it go." Catherine smiled gently, a look of understanding passing between them. "We can help with that," she said. Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly alongside Henry, pouring their knowledge and energy into revitalizing the ranch. They began with the basics, repairing the fences, cleaning up the fields, and fixing the barn. But they also focused on creating a sustainable system for the land, planting new crops, and raising healthy livestock. It was hard work, but it was the kind of work that felt fulfilling, that gave them purpose. Thomas and Catherine had learned so much from their own experience on their ranch, and now they were passing that knowledge on. Henry was a quick learner, and as they worked together, a bond began to form between them. It wasn't long before the ranch started to show signs of life again. The fields, once overgrown, were now dotted with healthy crops, and the barn was filled with animals once more. Henry's smile returned, and there was a new sense of pride in his eyes. "I didn't think I'd see the day," he said, looking out over the land. "But you too." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me hope again." Catherine placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the hard part, Henry. You kept this place going. We just helped you get back on track." It wasn't long before word spread about the revival of Henry's ranch. People from neighboring areas came to see the transformation, and soon, Thomas and Catherine's reputation as skilled and compassionate ranchers grew. They weren't just running a ranch. They were building a legacy of resilience, of people helping each other in times of need. As the seasons passed, the ranch flourished. Henry's property was no longer a symbol of despair, but a beacon of hope, much like Thomas and Catherine's own ranch. They had succeeded not just in rebuilding a piece of land, but in rebuilding lives. One evening, as Thomas and Catherine sat on the porch of their own ranch, watching the sun set over the land they had transformed, they reflected on how far they had come. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had also been rich with rewards. They had created a life together that was full of meaning, full of purpose, and they had helped others do the same. "I never imagined it would turn out this way," Thomas said, his voice full of awe. Catherine smiled, her eyes sparkling in the fading light. "Neither did I," she said softly. "But we did it. Together." Thomas nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. "Together," he echoed. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, they knew that no matter what challenges the future held, they would face them side by side, just as they always had. Their story was one of unexpected beginnings, hard work, and the power of community. And it was a story that would continue, not just for them, but for the many others whose lives they had touched along the way.